many of you fucking devils have never seen Cobra? If you've never seen Cobra, don't come over here with any stupid-ass fucking 2023 fucking recommendations. You're missing the fuck out.
That's most definitely what's up. Radio Free Innsmouth, episode 262. And despite the dulcet tones of Tenge Fuyuki you are currently hearing in the background, this one is going to be about a pretty darn obscure black metal band.
어플로 주문을 하던가?
How obscure, you might ask? Well, if anybody watching this or listening to this has heard of this band, you win the prize! Also, there's a fairly good chance you've probably personally interacted with me before, in which case, I am deeply sorry. Wouldn't wish that on anybody. But yeah, that's just how rarely I see Acheronian Dirge, the band in question, get mentioned by literally anybody that I'm not personally acquainted with. And it's a damn shame, because they're great. They're one of the few shining lights from a very dark era of black metal, at least if you ask me, particularly in the United States. We're talking about that rather short but seemingly interminable span of years some might call the turn of the millennium, when we go from single-digit 2000s to double digits right around 07 to 2012-ish. Now, some of the old-school US black metal masters were still around and putting out material, like Black Funeral and Profanatica, but Grand Belial's Key was MIA, along with Demoncy, and Judas Iscariot was officially, utterly gone, along with Averse Sephira having broken up after putting out their best album. There had been some bands on the West Coast doing stuff in the early 2000s that I did enjoy quite a bit, like Xasthur and Leviathan, but that had given license for the arrival of what we might call black gaze, the shoegazy black metal, the post-black metal. You know what it is, hipster black metal.
But if you're looking for that, there's motherfuckers in there, as soon as you get there, they got some hard dick for them butt cheeks.
And even the more true metal-minded of the US black metal contingent seemed to be oriented more towards playing stuff that was actually just death metal with a coat of black metal paint on it, talking about all the stuff that's like really obviously heavily influenced by Marduk, Cold of Azazel and whatnot. Might not have the immediate
Why are you gay?
fact they're the Starbucks bands, but it's still not something I'd be terribly interested in listening to that often. In fact, despite what you might think of me now, that time period was the peak of metal elitism for me, where I was pretty much refusing to listen to anything recorded after 1996, with very few exceptions to that rule. You know, this is the reason I got into all of those like Slavic bands, is because I was looking for black metal that I actually liked. And it was in the middle of this time period that Acheronian Dirge released pretty much all their material, and they were one of the few newer bands at the time that I really, really liked. Part of the reason for that is apparent as soon as you put on the album. You recognize that snare sound?
제가 V에 불러면 안 한다고.
Oh yeah, you know what time it is. They got that early Cryptopsy drum sound, my dude, and I'm all about that shit.
정적이어가지고.
Well, yeah, earlier I said I didn't like a lot of these like US death metal bands that are essentially just adopting black metal aesthetics. And now I'm saying I like Acheronian Dirge because they got the Cryptopsy drums. It's not really the same thing. I would say Acheronian Dirge, they have a lot of death metal elements, but the music they're playing is definitely, clearly, obviously black metal made by people that are into black metal. I would compare it to something like Infernal War or Thunderbolt in that regard. It uses a lot of death metal elements, but there's no way you're mistaking them for a death metal band. Not with dark medieval black metal waltz riffs like this, but to that they add this total brutal death metal drumming. In fact, this particular riff set reminds me quite a bit of Suffocation, and how they really hammer on the tremolo blasts and then finish each tail end riff off with drum accents on those 6 standout notes. It's black metal riffs being put into a brutal death metal style song structure, and it's honestly very unique sounding in that regard, and that sense of uniqueness doesn't let up even when the band lets up a bit in intensity, going from more of a creepy boom, haunted house vibe during the slow sections with these winding tremolo riffs and odd drum patterns almost doing this sort of breakdown type thing, leading into more traditional black metal, specifically Emperor style stuff, with the clear distinction between low and high guitar parts, But of course to that they add a brutal death metal style drum fill into the change-up. What I really find interesting about this drummer is he has this sort of like brutal death metal level of chops, but the way he plays everything is in this like loose, almost kind of Graveland-esque style, if that makes sense. It's very rolling. If you were to take a drummer from an early Graveland or Velez or Capricornus Thor's Hammer album and somehow instill in them a Dave Kohlross or Mike Smith level of technical proficiency, I feel like you'd end up with something like this. And it works perfectly for the music going on over top of it, because while it is fast and intense and technical, it's not sterile. It's very breathing in and out, sort of organic. And it was that combination of incredible technical proficiency with a raw, organic black metal feel that really made them stick out to me while they existed, particularly amongst the cadre of basically interchangeable, fast US black metal bands at the time.
Hold it. I know what you're thinking.
Where the hell did this drummer come from, and why haven't I heard of him before? Well, he initially came to the attention of the extreme metal community with a band called Throw Cult. In fact, one of the guitarists and the bassist from Acheronian Dirge were also in this band at one point. Before any of those guys actually joined Throw Cult, they had a history going back to the mid-90s when they were called Throat Culture and played some sort of industrial death metal, at least from what I've heard. I actually haven't heard their first album, but it doesn't really sound like something I'd be all that into. But by the time the Acheronian Dirge fellas were in Throw Cult, they had fully shifted over to sort of a maybe more standard American sounding blasting fast black metal, albeit with a slightly higher degree of originality than what such a description would lead you to believe. Mostly due to their guitar playing, which features way more weird change-ups than would be normal for this sort of fast-blasting American black metal. It's not quite as alive or organic sounding as Acheronian Dirge would end up becoming, but you can definitely hear the roots of where they were going to go with Acheronian Dirge in the Throw Coat album that all the Acheronian Dirge members played on. Interesting little bit of black metal history. And honestly, not a bad album for a rainy day, but it doesn't quite hit that same sort of unique atmosphere that Acheronian Dirge so effortlessly glides into, not only with their drums, but also with the guitar playing, doing all of its crazy layered shit. Acheronian Dirge is a band that clearly takes advantage of the fact that they got two guitarists. And they got one guy doing weird dissonant droning chords, and the other guy's doing this melodic tremolo riff into some sexy fucking lead guitar with super heavy, super simple riffs under it. Here's where the drums really help the music out, because he starts out playing this mid-paced beat under this riff, then when they come around for the second loop, he brings in that double bass, and it hits you right in the fucking balls. And a very death metal sounding transition back into that main tremolo riff from earlier in the song. Here's another interesting little songwriting trick. They introduce an idea, that being linking together death metal chugs with these sort of dissection style harmonies, then immediately go into a full stop, drum hit, and come back into it and elaborate on those ideas. It's like something Suffocation would do on Pierce from Within, but it's on a black metal album. It's like this album was made for me specifically. It's hitting all that stuff I like, and it's all fortuitously bolstered by the inclusion of some absolutely majestic melodic Castlevania core riffage, very apocalyptic in tone. Out of all of the other sort of modern day US black metal bands, these guys remind me a lot of Averse Sephra, not necessarily stylistically, but in terms of how they have these just really epic unfolding narratives utilizing a lot of death metal techniques in a black metal context. In the case of Averse Sephra, they took a whole lot of influence from Immolation. In the case of Acheronian Dirge, it's a little just more general brutal death metal stuff, mainly to my ears at least, Suffocation. Either way, both bands are down with the Asians, and that's alright with me.
Light 'em up!
They do have their quiet, contemplative moments as black metal is wont to do, but even then, those are kind of weird and creepy, particularly with the drumming and the layered, oddly psychedelic lead guitar.
You vomited forth from the gaping wound of a woman.
And the spooky samples. Actually, this particular riff has a bit of an Averse Sephra thing going on. That weird dissonant howling part, maybe even Bloodhouse Nord, or maybe even Death Spell Omega, except good. These cascading riffs right here are very nice. Cascading, not Cascadian. If these were Cascadian sounding riffs, I'd probably hate them. Headed back into that super dissonant section again, which paradoxically opens the door for some much more laid-back material, at least in terms of the blasting and the dissonance. Droning without being boring, with some very well-orchestrated, subtle percussion. And of course, those vocals. I haven't really talked about them that much because I don't know how much I can add to them in terms of analysis. They're filthy and they're disgusting and they're nasty and I absolutely love them.
And that's the bottom line.
That's about all I gotta say about that. And would you believe they got even better on their second official release? That being the charmingly titled Themes of Desperation Realized. Their first full length was called Sex Next Quadodium because Latin is spooky. Boom! On this release, they sound a little bit different. It's not like they entirely changed styles. They just decided to emphasize certain aspects of their music in lieu of others. There isn't anywhere near as much like death metal type stuff going on, but instead they really leaned into a lot of like the weird atmospheric shit you heard going on in that last song I played. And their songwriting got even more sophisticated. You can hear that in like the first few seconds of any of the tracks. For instance, the final song on the album, The Pale Horse Descends Upon Winter, starts out with a set of riffs, goes like... And you're thinking, hey, that's pretty neat. But then you realize that the album started off with a song called The White Horse in Spring's Rain, goes like... And then you realize the first riff on the album is a much more lively echo of the dreariness that is the first riff on the last song on the album. Then you realize, hey, this is a concept album equating the different horsemen of the apocalypse to different seasons. And it makes sense why it would be cyclical like that. It's so fucking smart!
We tried to tell him, but he's too stupid to see it!
And that sort of theming isn't just limited to a few cyclical riff patterns over the course of the album. Each of these songs does a really good job of emulating their respective horse and their respective season. For instance, the spring song has this livelier character, but it's also the white horse, which represents sort of like incipient conquering by the sword. So it builds an intensity like a growing plant, but also takes a turn for the negative by introducing much tenser variations on that opening riff and layering up guitar harmonies in a very sharp Slayer-esque fashion. If you had been led to believe that American bands couldn't do atmospheric black metal successfully, hopefully this song proves that you're full of shit, because man, this doomy riff fucks, as does its nastier, harmonized counterpart, which leads perfectly into the final blossoming of this malevolent plant, which proceeds to open up its spring buds and completely cover the earth with a magnificent cavalcade of blast beats and supremely fast tremolo-picked melodic riffs, which are, of course, a perfect counterpoint response to that initial doomier riff. Similarly, during The Pale Horse Descends Upon Winter, which of course is about winter and death, we got that dark mirror of the spring riff, now that everything's dead, and it even has a dark mirror of that transition into the more atmospheric part from that first song. Now that sort of like sheets of sound melodic tremolo playing is less like a plant kind of growing and more like sheets of freezing rain coming down. It actually reminds me a lot of the sort of riff you might hear on a Street album, and appropriately, this is about as close as they ever got to playing straight up depressive black metal. Here's a cool set of kind of doom death sounding riffs, very much in keeping with the winter theme, but also a very interesting variation on the riff that opened the song. And that leads into an interesting sort of showcase section for the rhythm section and the vocals. Very audible bass, probably the sickest the vocals ever got on the album, and the drummer proving that he can do just as many interesting things with slow riffs as he could do with that really fast, brutal death metal influence stuff on the first album. And we got sort of this loping lead guitar, kind of like something you hear on the first album as well. See what I mean? It's not like they abruptly changed styles more as they just decided to emphasize different aspects of their music than they did on the Sex Next Quad Odeon full length. And that's why I think Themes of Desperation Realized is one of the best black metal EPs of all time. And if you don't like it...
And I got news for you. That means you're gay.
Unfortunately, after this EP came out, the band broke up. Which really, really does suck because they were awesome. Mitigating factor, I guess that they never got a chance to like get shitty. But I mean, these guys were all clearly very talented musicians. Obviously, they went on to do other projects. And a couple of those kind of carried forward some of the concepts that made Acheronian Dirge such an interesting band in new and very different forms, entirely different genres even. The drummer, the bassist, and one of the guitarists formed a doom metal band called Flight of Sleipnir. Later on, the other guitarist also joined them in this band. Not your standard sort of Colorado doom metal. It's not really stoner at all. It has a lot of dark folk music to it, as you're hearing right now. And there's a heavy emphasis on Norse mythological themes. And very long songs with a lot of unfolding sections. Sound familiar? Well, it should, because Acheronian Dirge are all about that. The music also preserves that sort of rolling organic feel that made Acheronian Dirge so unique. Actually, a lot of it reminds me of Spirit Caravan, and I love Spirit Caravan, so obviously I think this is pretty cool too. The vocals are also almost kind of black metal-y. Maybe I'm coping, but they're certainly shriekier than you would normally expect for a doom metal band, but definitely shrieky enough to work for a Norse pagan themed band. There's a whole ton of Flight of Sleipnir albums, so if that sounds interesting to you, go check them out. The bassist and the vocalist from Acheronian Dirge formed another band called Stoic Dissension that kind of picks up on a lot of the harsher aspects of Acheronian Dirge and plays them in a new format. Again, it's kind of a doom metal thing, but not like Flight of Sleipnir's take on that genre at all. It's sort of a mix of black metal and doom metal, but it's not really funeral doom either, which is what you would usually expect with that description. It's kind of its own weird thing, and it's definitely very heavy. I feel like these guys were probably influenced by the band Esoteric a lot, which is another band I really like, so that's cool. I'm thinking that because, one, Stoic Dissension sounds like an Esoteric song title, and two, the album I have from them is 3 songs long, and it's almost an hour long. The last song is untitled, and the other 2 have similar weird names of Stoic Dissension, like the Pernicious Anoesis. I don't even know what that means, but it sounds like an Esoteric song title. But these guys obviously picked up on a lot of that weird dissonance, dark atmosphere, and sick fucking vocals from the Acheronian Dirge days. So both of those bands are pretty cool. I don't like them as much as Acheronian Dirge, but they're still definitely worth checking out, especially if you wanted to see what sort of other musical ideas the Acheronian Dirge guys have. But Acheronian Dirge, unquestionably amazing.
Go check them out. If you don't have it, you're missing the fuck out as far as I'm concerned.
If not, you are henceforth banished to the realm of death metal dudes giving incredibly cold takes about black metal.
Hope you like Dark Funeral, bitch.
No, please. Anything with that. No.
You know, just something to keep in mind. But anyways, thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye-bye.
I fucking love Black Girl Brian.
Ah!